Good afternoon and welcome to Have We Got Planning News for You. Thank you all for tuning in, whether you're doing so live or subsequently on any of our streaming products. Can I remind you, first and foremost, to consider making a charity donation in lieu of registration fee. The growing list of charities we support is on our website, havewegotplanningNewsForYou.com. And as always, you're more than welcome to make a donation to a local charity of your choice. Now, without further ado, can I welcome to the show Pooja Agrawal, the co-founder of Public Practice, whose task it is to build the public sector's capability to improve the quality, equality and sustainability of places. And how apt it is that you're joining us only a few days after the Office for Place was abolished, more of which later. That was by accident rather than by design, but very, very time appropriate. Pooja, tell us where you're calling us from this evening, what, if anything, you're drinking, and what have you chosen as your theme for today's show?
Thank you, Charlie, and hi, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. So I am dialing in from my office. It's a co-working space in central London. I am drinking water, sadly, because I've been fighting off this cold, which I think loads of people seem to be doing at the moment. And the theme I chose, so I'm a bit of a music head. I've got quite a wide variety of interests, and music within music have quite a wide variety of music interests. So the theme I chose was sort of linking planning and music, and it's choosing a song about a place.
And what song have you chosen about what place yourself?
Okay, so this is going to position me in the kind of cool category, and I'm going for it. So I've chosen a North London hip hop artist and kind of like a poet, I call Lexa Moore. And she really talks so much about cities and her love for place and how it's influenced her. So the song itself is called Mind the Gap, and it's about the tube and has actual samples of the tube in the song. And with the Sterling Prize being awarded to the Lizzie line this year, I felt it was sort of apt to this conversation to talk about quality design, places and music.
Fantastic. And there, by contrast, I look like a Philistine because I've chosen Elvis Presley's Viva Las Vegas. There we are. You can take the boy out of Birmingham. I was going to choose something even less appropriate, but there we are. But Elvis is the king after all. Always has been, always will be. And I'm drinking champagne, Storm Shadows. Thank you very much, Keir Starmer. Now, as always, Pooja, if you've watched the show before, you'll know that no obligation at all to comment on any of our cases. But equally, if you did want to, you're more than welcome. And failing which, we're really looking forward to your discussion led by Mary in the second half of the show. Mary is looking particularly bookish this evening with all those more ports behind you. Anyway, without further ado, Mary, on to you. Tell us, where are you? In the library, presumably?
I'm in one of it used to be the library, and you can see my old JPLs behind me in green, but I'm in the town legal offices, thank you very much. And although I don't I'm not dressed like I was back in the day, my song is London Calling. By The Clash, which I think is just an excellent song. And I'm also looking at a book which is called The Changing Face of London, because it's an ever-changing place. And thank you, Charlie. Oh, I'm like Pooja, drinking water.
I'm going to have to change my background because it looks like Elvis is nibbling my ear in a sort of rather loving way. If anyone's going to nibble my ear, Elvis will be a good candidate, but... there we are. Anyway, Thea, lovely to see you.
Hello, good evening. And hello, Pooja. Very well, thank you, Charlie. I am dialing in from my home office again this evening, and I'm joining the water gang, I'm afraid. Very dull. But in terms of the theme, I haven't taken leave of my senses and turned up to do this webinar in a hoodie. It is because it is a Snow Patrol hoodie, and they... sing a song called New York. So I thought that was good. Obviously, Pooja spent some time in America as a child, so I don't know if Pooja, you went to New York, but anyway, that's my song for this evening, and I'm going to have to take it off shortly because it's actually really very warm.
Now, Sasha, this is the moment when you say you used to hang out with Elvis in California when you grew up, and you have a hat that was given to you by Snow Patrol. Is that right?
Charlie, I'll tell you that story another time.
I knew it.
I've got a crisis of identity because I'm where Paul should be and Paul's where I should be. I am in the Stantec offices at the Quayside in Newcastle. So my song should be Fog on the Tyne. It's very sad. As I walked down there, Paul, I was thinking about Paul Gascoigne and Chris Waddle and their famous appearance on Top of the Pops and in the light of tonight's show. But actually, my song is going to be The Angel by Louis Dunford, which obviously all of you know my football allegiances will understand why I choose that, which illustrates my affection for a certain part of Islington.
Ah, very good. And finally, Paul, I know where that is. It's your hometown.
It's my hometown. It's Scarborough. So my song is Scarborough Fair, which is a really annoying song covered by Simon and Garfunkel, and which is one of the few things that people ever knew about Scarborough until recently it's become known as Scarbados. So my song is Scarborough Fair, and this is my hometown. And you're wrong, Sasha. I was in London this morning. I'm now back up in the northeast, having burst through the door. So I'm just down the road from you. So welcome to the northeast, Canny Lab. And I too am tragically drinking water. So cheers. Hello, Pooja.
I can't imagine you passing through a door in any other way than bursting through it, Paul. You are a ball burster, if ever there was one. Now, straight back to you, because you're going to tell us all about the news.
Yes, I am. And firstly, while I was in London, and this is, let me just turn this horrible background off because it really isn't like, oh, that's myself up. Really isn't like that anymore in Scarborough.
This is why we have Rob.
It's what it's really like. So I bought this in London. So the first bit of news is I got one of these. So if you look on the news, one of these sold for £6 million earlier on today. So I'm reckoning that this 50 quid, anybody? So I'll put it on eBay later on. Charlie's bound to buy it. So thirds of news. Firstly, the tragic passing of John Prescott, aged 86 today, former Deputy Prime Minister from 1997 to 2007 when he had planning powers, MP for Hull, or as it's correctly pronounced with the silent H, Hull. He was the first Secretary of State, and he was the one that oversaw the rise of RPG to become RSS, and the rise supposedly of what was going to be regional assemblies and a regional level of planning, which with the benefit of the last 15 years of hindsight, I think he might have been right rather than just chucking it all back down to localism. Second piece of news is that we've had a message from the chief planner. So every once in a while, Joanne Overley writes to chief planners and tells them what else is of interest. It's sort of a rival to what we do, but she does it in letter form, and she's told chief planners yesterday about the New Town's compulsory purchase of land amendment regulations, which removes hope value in some circumstances from compulsory acquisition, making CPOs rather cheaper. It's going to be very interesting to see how that pans out. Next piece of interesting news is Matthew Pennycook appeared before the Select Committee for DCLG or HLCLG this week and said a few interesting things. Amongst those interesting things, having scribbled them all down, we are going to get the National Development Management policies, which will be consulted upon next year. It's only taken them 4 years to actually come up with the draft, even quicker than some plans. But when they are to be published, we're told there will be yet another version of MPPF, but this time it's going to be a slimmer version because it's going to deal with principally how to do a local plan. So NDMPs are going to be covering an awful lot of development management, it would seem. So look forward to how that transforms our lives. He's also said that he intends to make full use of powers of intervention for recalcitrant authorities who aren't granting consent on large sites, which will no doubt take away a large amount of our work from behind the scenes, brackets, don't laugh, close brackets. And he's also going to review the criteria for intervening so as to widen it to expand the powers for recalcitrant authorities who are no doubt underfunded and will be delighted to have the requisite funds and timely consultation responses to allow consents to be granted more quickly. He's also accepted that delivering 1.5 million houses this Parliament is going to be a bit more difficult than he expected, Not least, presumably, because he didn't start off by pulling Mr. Gove's amendments to MPPF that he published last December in the way that he did in relation to Mr. Pickles' you can't have onshore wind farms anymore. Shame about that. So lots of interesting things. And if you look on LinkedIn, I think half of the planning bar has put up links to his appearance. So there's lots and lots of links if you've got an extra half an hour. Didcot is my next item of news. An inspector has dismissed an appeal by Persimmon and Taylor Wimpey into a proposal to discharge conditions on an outline consent granted for 4,000 homes. That application was granted in outline in 2022. I'm not trying to steal a case to myself whilst telling you the news. It just struck me as being particularly interesting that you end up with a scheme for 4,000 homes, which gets kicked into touch on the basis of the design of bridges across a stream in the same week that we've got Matthew Pennycook saying how difficult it's going to be to deliver 1.5 million homes. So really giving you that as a contrast between how the system doesn't work and how the system ought to work. We're also going to have the high street auctions, which have now been introduced. The regulations have been made, which allows an authority to intervene and auction off empty shops, provided they've been empty for more than a year. They're quite Byzantine if you look at the regulations, so quite how successful it's going to be, I don't know, but that's going to be interesting. And then the big news of this week, the big news closest to my heart, is that those who wrote our theme music, those who have played the incidental music on our show for the last 4 years, the Ruby Tuesdays, are playing their final gig. So they've decided to hang up their guitars, hang up their drums, and their final gig for anybody who wants to turn up is on the 20th of December at the Clear the Road Schoolrooms. It's already virtually sold out, I am told, but thank you to the Ruby Tuesdays. None of them are leaving music. There will be other incarnations. However, they deserve our thanks and supports for all that they've done for the show over the last 4 years. And that, Charlie, is this week's news.
Amen to that, the Ruby Tuesdays. On the subject of Select Committee appearances, breaking news. It's just been communicated to us a few minutes ago that Angela Rayner's pulled out of appearing for the House of Lords Built Environment Select Committees on the 3rd of December. They're doing a inquiry into Greybelt, and she's pulled out. Might that mean that the MPPF is going to be a few days afterwards? She doesn't want to say anything immediately beforehand. Who knows? Anyway, what we do know is that the chair of that committee will be coming on the show on the 5th of December, so we can find out from him what he thinks. Anyway, without further ado, Sasha is going to take us to Plymouth and tell us about contempt of court.
I am. But before I do that, can I just mention also an update on Statement of Common Grounds and topic papers? We should mention, Paul, the emergence, the Jonathan Ball initiative to use topic papers as a meaningful tool in inquiries and the new guidance.
Absolutely.
So you did WhatsApp me to say that I should have added that to the news. So sorry about that, Sash.
No. So let me talk about contempt of court. I think this is quite interesting because, as we know, there was the Carnworth report into enforcement powers, and one of the key changes in the early 90s was injunctions. And we know that a lot of authorities in the initial rush were very enthusiastic. I think they've actually fallen into slight disuse, or far less prevalent than they were in the 90s, the use of injunction powers under the Town and Country Planning Act. Anyway, I'm taking us to what is known as Mary's second home, the city of Plymouth, where she spent many years battling invaders, including myself, successfully on various occasions. And in Plymouth, there was a scheme that the City Council were promoting, which necessitated the destruction of many trees, the loss of many trees. Not unsurprisingly, many local residents were very upset about what they felt was the unnecessary loss of these trees. To be fair to Plymouth, there was a scheme of replacement, but of course, many people felt very angry about it, and they sought to take direct action to protect the trees. What happened is the leader of the council one afternoon, under delegated power, signed authority, and within a couple of hours the contractors were on the site. And one of the lead objectors, and Miss Alison White, no relative as far as I know at the moment, decided to get an injunction and got an emergency ex parte injunction to stop the contractors. And she arrived with the injunction on site at about midnight as the contractors were effectively taking down the trees, and the work stopped. In time, for political reasons, Plymouth did not pursue that scheme and decided to do an alternative. And effectively, the litigation that led to the injunction was superseded, were effectively considered academic. So that didn't actually go anywhere. But there were two further pieces of litigation that arose out of that. And effectively, Miss Alison White alleged and took proceedings alleging that the LPPA was in contempt of court following the granting of the injunction, and that the LPA's actions directly interfered with the due administration of justice once the injunction had been granted, because there was a period by which the LPA carried on with the trees, and there was obviously on site, we can imagine it was probably pretty chaotic on site with the contractors trying to do their work, the objectors objecting, and then this emergence of an injunction at midnight where probably tempers were pretty high in the circumstances that arose. But anyway, for the court had to decide whether effectively the LPA acted appropriately in the light of the granting of the injunction, and whether also the LPA were in contempt of court. And I think this is a really important case because it shows the seriousness of such matters. But the court, in deciding this matter on both grounds, felt that the Plymouth City Council had not been in contempt of court. What's required is quite a high legal threshold, a strong prima facie case, and the judge said it cannot sensibly be argued that the LPA was prevented the claimant from the access to the court. So that was the third ground. And the second ground, looking at the actual evidential matrix, that the defendants hadn't acted in contempt of the order that had been granted. So the proceedings were unsuccessful. But I think this is an illustration that all of us involved in development management and enforcement should realise the seriousness and the gravity of injunctive proceedings, both for those who seek them and those on the receiving end of them. Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks very much, Sasha. An important lesson. Now, over to central Bedfordshire, where housing appeals been allowed. And Thea, you're going to tell us all about it.
I am. Thanks, Charlie. And I'm going to start this in the way that Lord Justice Lindblom sometimes starts his judgments in saying that there is nothing novel about this case. It's a decision of Inspector Carol Dillon, who some of you may know from local plan examination work, on an appeal by Gladman Developments Limited. And it was for 170 new homes at Langford, central Bedfordshire, as you say, Charlie. It's outside but adjacent to the settlement boundary. And it's a greenfield site, so something we would wholly expect to see. And unsurprising, given that context, to learn that the main issues were the acceptability of the location of the appeal site, having regard to the spatial strategy and the 5-year housing land supply, impact of the scheme on the character and appearance of the area, whether the loss of best and most versatile agricultural land was justified, the effect on local non-designated heritage assets, and finally, and this one's slightly more interesting, whether the proposed planning obligations met the terms of Regulation 122 of the SIL regs. In particular, it was the monitoring fee sought by the council that was an issue between the parties. So on housing land supply, the best case for the council, having gone through all of the disputed sites, was 4.84 years. So the inspector didn't need to address further issues like oversupply or large windfall, which were also in contention between the parties. And she commented it would serve no useful purpose to make any further comment on those. The loss of BMV was 9.7 hectares, but given that was below the Natural England consultation threshold, we're all aware of 20 hectares, the magic number, and given that the mapping showed that a considerable level of BMV would remain following the loss of the appeal site, the inspector didn't consider its loss significant and identified no policy conflict as a result of that loss. So heritage was next. And as I said, the only issue between the parties was harm to non-designated heritage assets, the significance of which were agreed not to be commensurate to a designated heritage asset. So the inspector, I think, probably got the approach a bit wrong on this issue in this paragraph, because she carried out a separate heritage balance at paragraph 67. She gave great weight to the non-designated heritage assets and in effect approached them as though the framework paragraphs 205 and 207 applied, which of course they don't, because non-designated heritage assets are covered at paragraph 209, which requires that the effect of the application on the significance of a non-designated heritage asset should be taken into account in determining the application, and in weighing applications that directly or indirectly affect non-designated heritage assets, a balanced judgment will be required, having regard to the scale of the harm or loss and the significance of the heritage asset. So it's not a great weight issue in the same way as designated heritage assets would attract that weighting, and it doesn't demand a separate heritage balance. But in any event, it didn't matter much, because even on the inspector's more protective approach, she found the development was acceptable, and that fed through into the final conclusions, which was that the scheme should be allowed. Now, the more interesting point in this case is in respect, as I said, of the monitoring contributions sought by the council, because the UU here contained all of the usual suspects: green infrastructure, affordable housing, contributions to healthcare, leisure facilities, and so on. So there was nothing that stood out as particularly unusual or difficult. But the council was asking for a monitoring fee, an eye-watering fee in the region of £81,000. And it did that on the basis of a fixed £500 per non-financial obligation. But the monitoring associated with financial contributions was sought on the basis of a percentage of the total value of those contributions. And it's not the first time that the council had done this at an appeal, and it's not the first time they lost, you won't be surprised to know. No explanation was given by the council as to why a greater financial contribution made in some instances once should generate such a high level of additional work. So the appellant very sensibly proposed a monitoring fee of £20,500, which is still pretty tasty, but that was related to the sum of £500 per obligation and per action per obligation, so the monitoring of those, and it related to both financial and non-financial obligations. So listeners may know that monitoring fees are caught by Regulation 122, and they should be fairly and reasonably related in scale and kind to the development and shouldn't exceed the authority's estimate of its cost of monitoring the development over the lifetime of the planning obligations. So what the inspector said about all of this was that the evidence was lacking to justify the council's position, including why there was a difference in some sought to monitor financial and non-financial obligations that just hadn't been explained. And so the inspector went with the appellant's figure of £20,500, regarding that as the appropriate sum in accordance with Regulation 122.
Thanks, Thea. Very interesting. It's the old thorny chestnut of monitoring fees. Now, talking about thorny chestnuts, I'm going to take you to St Albans, where another housing appeal has been allowed in the Green Belt, this time by a decision of Inspector Holly Mickles on the 7th of November, a couple of weeks ago, for a 95 dwelling development for Scott Properties on a greenfield site adjacent to, but outside the settlement boundary in the Green Belt. An interesting quirk of this decision was the council didn't defend the appeal, and they didn't even defend the costs application, albeit there's a debate about the extent of that application. There was, however, a Rule 6 party, and the inquiry took several days. So clearly there was nonetheless a significant contest for the appellant to overcome. Now, it was common ground between all the parties. The development was inappropriate development, fairly obviously, because it's a major greenfield development in the Greenbelt. And the inspector nonetheless allowed the appeal based upon very special circumstances. Now, in doing so, she found the development would result in definitional harm to the Greenbelt, but also that it would conflict with two purposes of the Greenbelt, both through a modest effect on Purpose B, which seeks to prevent the merging of towns, and a substantial harm to Purpose C, safeguarding the countryside from encroachment, was also significant harm to openness. As a result of the provisions of the NPPF relating to Greenbelt, she did as she had to, which was to give all of that substantial weight. However, on the flip side, the St Albans was only able to demonstrate a 1.7 years housing land supply, and that's been in very low numbers for some time now and been going downhill in the context of a very old local plan, which was, I think, adopted before even I did my GCSEs, and the replacement of which was stored on multiple occasions. The inspector considered in that light that the contribution of the proposed plan to housing supply, to affordable housing, and to a lesser degree customer self-build, along with all the miscellaneous benefits such as BNG and economic benefits, cumulatively clearly outweighed the harm to the Greenbelt. And therefore, she granted permission. Now, what's interesting about this bill, albeit with the caveat the council didn't defend it, but is most of, not all of, but most of the very special circumstances housing appeal decisions in the last few years have involved some kind of special factor, whether it's been a country park or a special needs school or a GP surgery or a scout hut, etc., something to sort of differentiate itself from what might otherwise be said, not my words, but to be a sort of cookie cutter 100 home development, 40% affordable housing, 5% customer self-build, and so on. Now, this wasn't. It didn't have any of those factors. This was essentially what you would expect a 95 dwelling development to be on a greenfield site. And yet, nonetheless, the crippling housing need and lack of a foreseeable solution to that housing need led not only the inspector to find very special circumstances for the council to see the writing on the wall and acknowledge that. The context of the council's position was that members had deferred their decision until they were to get advice. The advice was accept the inevitable, and they still decided to oppose the appeal. And it seems that at some point they did belatedly recognise the inevitable. There was then an argument about whether the appellant should get its cost of dealing with the Rule 6 parties case as well. But clearly it's indicative of the fact that in the Greenbelt Shires, where Greenbelt is washed over pretty much every greenfield site outside the settlement boundaries, where there's a plan is still some way off, where the housing land supply is truly crippling, it may well be that in the right locations, at least, and this wasn't a clean sheet, so there was some harm beyond the inevitable harm, but in the right locations, very special circumstances may well exist even without any of those special factors. And that's before the new MPPF, which creates all sorts of other opportunities for appropriately located development in the Green Belt. So an interesting decision, it seems to me, albeit against rather unusual factual background and procedural background. And with that, Mary, I'll pass over to you to commence the interview. Pooja.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Pooja, it's an absolute pleasure to have the kind and lovely task of introducing you. So welcome to the show. You are one of the co-founders of Public Practice, an organisation which is dedicated to building the capacity of local government, which, by goodness, we need, which you began in 2017. You grew up in a variety of places, but in the main, Mumbai. You moved to London when you were 16, where you finished your education, and then you went on to Cambridge to study architecture, and then on to the Bartlett School of Architecture, part of London University, and then to the University of Westminster, all the while completing your long architectural study. And then you went to work initially in the private sector for Publica, and We Made That, great name, before switching to the public sector, where you started working at the GLA, overseeing policy, helping with the Mayor's Design Advocates and Review panel, and where you became a Regeneration Principal Project Officer. From there, you founded Public Practice. Subsequently, you have done a stint with Homes England. Pretty interesting out there career here as an assistant director in the service strategy. And in 2021, you became the Chief Executive Officer of Public Practice. You've been repeatedly recognised as a woman of influence, And last year in particular, you won multiple awards, including UK Reef's People and Skills Award. And all the while, throughout your career, it seems to me, you've advocated on social media or in public speaking roles, various conferences here and abroad, or you've authored. All the while, you've advocated for sustainable cities, as well as for the differing roles that architects can play in delivering places. So, Pooja, I hope that is a fair summary of what you have done in, if I may say, your very short life, because you've got all your career ahead of you.
It's supposed to be that young as you think I am, but here we go.
I certainly think you have. From where I'm sitting and bearing in mind my age, you definitely have. So I've got some questions. First question, please, is what inspired you in the first place to become an architect?
Thanks, Mary. So it's actually quite a tough question to answer because I'm not sure my ambition was ever to become an architect. I think I chose to study architecture because I was always a bit of a sort of jack of all trades. I mean, I'm hardly a jack. I'm a J of all trades. But anyway, always interested in lots and lots of different things. And I think partly maybe the way the education system is in the UK, you're quite young. You need to sort of choose a kind of particular avenue of study or expertise. And for me, architecture kept multiple doors open. So it enabled me to continue with my interest in creativity. I was really interested in art. So architecture enabled me to continue to draw and to sketch and do photography and make models, whilst also using the other more analytical and technical part of my brain in sort of structures and kind of construction environment. And I suppose perhaps what I hadn't expected, but what really kind of inspired me while I was studying architecture was almost the sociological aspect of it. So thinking about how, as an architect, you're influencing and framing the way people live their lives. And I think that's possibly the kind of thread that has continued through my very kind of squiggly career, is just how do you influence people's sort of everyday life in a positive way.
I love the way you started that answer by referencing drawings. Sometimes when you go into architectural practices, you see ranks of people sitting at computers, and you think, oh, where are those good old days when people had this great skill of just getting their pencil out and coming up with something incredible really quickly. But I digress. What difference, bearing in mind your experience working in the private sector and then the public sector, what difference, if any, did you experience in those differing roles?
I think there's quite a lot of differences, and I'm sort of going to try and sort of put them into sort of three key differences. So I guess the first was actually just the day-to-day experience of the type of work. So within architecture, I always sort of pushed the boundaries and did a range of things, working in interior design to working on city scale design. But it usually ended up being sort of one project. I was overseeing one project, and you get into quite a depth of knowledge of that one particular place. Whilst in the public sector, I had the joy of actually overseeing and influencing multiple projects at the same time, whether it's, a ton of high street regeneration projects or community centres and so forth. So the kind of scale of thinking on the day-to-day experience changed. And the second thing I would touch on is culture. So I think architecture in particular has a very particular culture of working, not very positive actually. And there's a lot said about this around working hours, also a lack of diversity actually within the sector. But also, you're actually surrounded by lots of creative people. But with my kind of J of all trades hat on, what I loved about the public sector was actually working with a range of people, from economists to data specialists or people who had sort of public art commissioning experience or health specialists, and actually working with people with lots of different expertise, but also lived experience was really, really interesting. And I loved that. Felt like I learned so much from lots of different people. And I guess the third thing I would say was the sort of influence. I came out of university when the sort of financial crisis was very present. There was hardly any work, but also lots of architects, lots of my peers were working on, still weirdly on luxury flats, and you're designing the window detailings of this posh flat on the 50th floor, whilst actually not really being able to even afford a place in London, if that, that's where we were at the time. Whereas actually moving into the client side of the road, and for me, the public sector, I found it super rewarding to be able to almost influence in a much more strategic way around policy, or influences about how much social housing there is and so forth. So that range of influence, I felt like as a client, you were making key decisions that then was being handed over to the architect to just design and deliver it.
I think we would all resonate. We all recognise the one of the great things about our planning world is that we get to work with, my lights have gone out here, but we get to work with all sorts of other interesting professionals, like architects, like engineers. I mean, it's one of the great things that you're part of a great team, and it's a great joy to actually meet all these lovely people. Let's focus on public practice. What, please, is the purpose of public practice? Can you explain that to our listeners while I jump up and down and get the
lights back on? So I guess I'll start with the problem. And I think it's a well-known problem that there is a lack of resources and skills in local government. I think it's well rehearsed, and interestingly, I think it's also across political party awareness, whether it's the right or the left, everyone sees the kind of challenge of resources in the public sector. We, as public practice, run a insights, a data survey every year. And in our last survey, more than half of the officers said they didn't have the capacity to meet their strategic goals beyond their minimum statutory responsibilities. So what we're seeing is that the planning system, the placemaking system, everything is very, very reactive. So you're not really able to think much more bigger and think about, actually, what are we trying to achieve here? You're sort of always on the back foot. So I think that we see that very direct link between local authorities having the right skills, the right people in-house to be able to have the vision and to be able to actually create better places. And that's where public practice is coming from. We are a not-for-profit organisation. We started out at the GLA, but we created an independent organisation because we were always ambitious and always knew that there was going to be an opportunity to influence the skills and capability across the country and perhaps beyond. So what do we do? I guess, again, in sort of three different pillars. The first thing is actually attracting the right skills. We're best known for our associate programme, which is basically a job placement scheme. And we attract mid-career professionals, so somewhere between 30 to 55k, architects, urban designers and planners, but also increasingly sustainability experts, engineers and ecologists, for example, and we place them into jobs in local authorities. So the local authorities are directly employing these people. We are almost facilitating and enabling those people to come into the public sector. And the reason, like, people ask us, why do you get all these people applying to you? And a lot of what we do is basically campaign and push the message out that you can make a huge impact in the public sector. So that's kind of a key part of what we do. And over the years, we've recently, for example, launched a jobs board, which again is about attracting more senior people into the public sector. But it's not just about bums and seats. So the second thing, I think, by bringing those people in, it's about actually improving ways of working and improving the processes of the public sector. Everyone talks about bureaucracy, but it's a machine, and how do you actually get it to work better? So a lot of what we do is we train our associates, the people we bring in, but also wider officers to think about culture change and how to work better within a system. And there's something around kind of confidence and resilience within the public sector to actually bring about change and think about that sort of bigger term, longer term, what are you trying to achieve? And for us, all of this builds the kind of capacity and capability, therefore enables the public sector to have a positive impact on place. And like you said, we just almost by talking about it, by exposing officers to good practice, take them to really good housing schemes, facilitate knowledge. There's such siloed ways of working. people are trying to solve the problem in different ways. We're enabling people to share best practice between each other.
I mean, it feels like you're doing an enormous amount of public good because you're enthusing people. I think we on this program are desperately conscious of the limited resources in the public sector, in the planning world in which we operate. We're super conscious that, people go to local authorities and then they get picked off, if you like, by the private sector, and they don't necessarily find a pathway back in. And it sounds to me as if you're focused on helping people find a pathway back in. So I absolutely salute you. And it seems to me we need one of you in every major city in this country, ASAP. Can you give us a sense of the numbers of professionals that are applying for your courses?
Absolutely. So we've been running for about 7 years, and actually, thanks to MHCLG, in the last 3 years, we have expanded our program across all of England. So we are now running our associate program across England. So every round, we get hundreds of people applying to be part of the program. So our last round, we had almost 500 people, and we tend to have 2 cohorts of people at one point of time. So it gets whittled down to somewhere between 20 to 50 people. So it's very, very competitive as well.
Wow.
And so in the last 7 years, we've placed about 350 people across 100 authorities. And just to say, I guess in terms of the impact, most of these people are coming from the private sector, so over 90% of people. So we're fundamentally bringing a whole new wave of people in, and about 75% of those people are still in the public sector about 3 years on. And that is what we see is actually a fundamental impact, where our survey says 20% of officers are planning to leave the public sector in the next 2 years. We're actually fundamentally reversing that trend of the leakage and bringing people back in.
So looking ahead, what skills do you think will be required to best equip us, not only for new green energy, retrofitting, but also the development of new places and new towns to meet the 1.5 million homes? What skills do you think will be required?
So I think in the kind of shorter term, if we're talking about the sort of current government, there's obviously such a huge focus on housing and delivering housing really, really quickly. And actually there is I think a need for more strategic skills, maybe even planning lawyers in the public sector. Hello, we can talk about that after. But just people to be able to unlock and unblock some of the blockages on the kind of larger sites and CPOs and housing delivery and infrastructure delivery and so forth. But I think in the kind of medium to longer term, when I sort of think about the, sort of future visioning of this, we do need to be much more resilient and thinking and planning for climate change. And I think that's not sort of spoken about enough. So construction is, one of the biggest carbon emitters. And I don't think it's necessarily being tackled heads on at the moment in terms of the types of skills we require. And our approach to public practice has always been, you need multidisciplinary skills to look at these places. So yes, you need planners, but you also need urban designers. You also need ecologists. You need all of these different skills. The technical knowledge for retrofitting is very specific. So how you bring all of those skills together is key. And then the other thing I think is still related to this is almost the way of working. And it's a bigger question about what we think the role of the state is in the future. So I think Grenfell is a really bad example of sort of system failure and the role of the state not keeping people safe. But COVID potentially is a good example of where local government and central government had to really quickly reorganize. Officers who were planners were actually working on distributing, vaccines across the country. So if we're thinking ahead to the sort of types of skills you need, it's not necessarily always the professional skills you need, but how you work and adapt to change. And, with global change and people, think about immigration and people moving, think about what the cost of temporary accommodation is going to be in 10 to 15 years. Those are the things we need to be thinking about as the future of what the state can do.
Yeah, well, I dread to think what the costs of temporary accommodation are now, actually, never mind in 10 years' time, but I'm going to zip my mouth on that topic for the moment. I think I know what you're going to say. The answer to this is, but I think it's important that everyone hears your voice. What's more important to you, quantity or quality, and why?
This is fighting talk now. I fundamentally think quality is so important, and maybe it's obvious, but I just think perhaps the word quality is misunderstood, and I think maybe that's what I'll sort of try and emphasize. I don't think there's any point in building 1 million homes if they're going to be covered in damp in 3 years' time. You know, if we're seeing the number of homes tackling poverty, the people who are going to end up in these homes, in the poor quality homes, are going to be those people who don't have a choice. So I think we need to really rethink quality as being really fundamental. It's like a basic human right, the opportunity to have light, to have air, to have, you know, connections to your local high street. All of those things for me is what design is. It's not an elitist concept. And I think there's evidence, there's, you know, the Marmot review around actually linking housing directly to life expectancy. So we need to think of quality in terms of a basic fundamental human right, as opposed to being a kind of elitist expectation.
Thank you, Pooja. What's the role of equality in sustainability?
I think similarly to sort of earlier, there's a kind of bigger question about sort of migration and the impact of you know, who is going to have to move when times come. You know, not everyone's buying bunkers in New Zealand at the moment. But I think on a very practical note, actually something like Passive House, the impact that can have on fuel poverty, for example, is incredible. And there's really good examples. A Starling Prize winner a few years ago in Norwich, which the Goldsmith Street shows actually, you know, a few years on, the residents, the social housing, actually, they've saved a lot of money in terms of the energy crisis. So I think something like Passive House actually is really, we need to kind of push it more in terms of equality and sustainability, but not seeing these as sort of separate points.
What's your reaction to the Treasury's commitment to train 300 more planners?
So I think it's, as I said earlier, it's clearly a kind of cross-political acknowledgement that there is a fundamental challenge. For me, it's always, and it's not like the number. There's like, yeah, great 300 planners, sure, that's great. But actually, it's like how you're actually thinking about this strategically. Because obviously, if you divided this equally, it's going to be less than a planner per council. So, you know, where are you actually putting these planners? You know, public practice always talks about planners in a broader sense as well. I think it would be a sort of a shame if they were at a very junior, if all of them were at a junior level doing development management. It goes back to this idea that we should be thinking more strategically, thinking much more longer term, much more multidisciplinary, all of those points around actually with new towns, you need to be thinking about it holistically as an urban design project with a vision, as opposed to just sort of pushing through what comes. So I think that it's a brilliant opportunity. We just need to make sure it's being done with the right skills, the right level of government.
Yeah, I feel like because local plans have had such a torrid time and we haven't really had any, councils have lost their way a bit, some of them, and they're not thinking in a positive, visionary way. They're just spending too long thinking about how they can avoid development. But that's not everyone by any means. So I've hogged you. I need to open things up. Thea, what's your question, please?
Hi, Pooja, and thanks, Mary. Pooja, you've lived in America and Mumbai and London, and I wonder, it might be one of those, it might be a completely different place, but what is the place that's had the biggest impact on you professionally, and why?
I don't know if I'm sort of post-rationalizing this, but I think growing up in Mumbai had such a profound impact on the way I think about places. I've never studied architectural planning in Mumbai, and I've never even worked there. But I think just growing up I grew up in the north of Mumbai. It's quite a linear city, and we grew up quite near the sea. And it's a suburban area, yet I grew up in a 7-story building, you know. So I was walking around in Letchworth Garden City yesterday, and I was thinking, this is just like 30,000 people. There's 3,000 people in my school, let alone in my neighborhood. So I think it had a huge impact on me in terms of how I think about density, about public space as well, because in Mumbai there isn't much public space that's equal. There's huge levels of inequality, and where I grew up there was lots of informal housing, and the only place actually people sort of tended to share public space was the beach. So I feel like it made me really think about public space, the rights to a public place, and safety as well, because being a woman in Mumbai can also not feel very safe all the time.
Thank you.
Sasha, what's your question?
Thank you, Mary. Yes, in the light of your questions, I would like to ask the question I'm very interested in is what is the effect of policy and government intervention on design and the schemes that we bring forward? Can the government, and through effectively the publication and enforcement of policy, change the quality of design?
I really strongly do think you have a huge impact. And I think that's exactly what public practice is if you have those right skills influencing the right policies, it makes a big difference. So I think permitted development rights is a really good example when you don't have policy, the impact it has. So the office to housing resi conversions, which happened, there's a huge wave of them. That's a good example when you're watering down policy and regulation. Actually, what we ended up with were a number of homes which didn't have windows, didn't have light. And so not having the right policy has a really detrimental impact on the quality of a space. And going back to Mary's point earlier around local plans, I think local plans are a really good tool for officers to feel like they know what the overarching vision of a place is, and therefore come from a place of confidence whilst negotiating throughout. So you're not looking at things in a piece-to-piece decision-making process. You actually have a kind of overarching idea of what the place is for me, which is what design is. So I think it is really important to have the right policy and the right regulation in place. Otherwise, you end up with, I think, finances shaping and carving what cities become.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mary. What an interesting discussion. I loved your question, appreciate your answer about your most inspirational place. We could have a 3-hour discussion on what makes a great place, and also the role of water. You mentioned water. Do you need water? Queer question mark. Yeah, exactly. Anyway, that's another rabbit hole. Come back and we can have a whole special discussion on that. But I'm actually going to follow up on what Sasha said. Predictably enough, given my comment at the beginning of the show, I'm going to ask you, because someone has to, what are your views on the closure of the office for Place?
So I have lots of views. I always have too many views, but I'll try and make it succinct. I think, unfortunately, it was inevitable because of the political alignment of the Office for Place. The sort of genesis of the Office for Place came from a very particular ideology around beauty, from the sort of Schoolton theology to the Building Better Beautiful Commission. And I think they positioned beauty so strongly as their approach that I think it got themselves perhaps into a bit of this is a sort of Tory agenda. Obviously that sort of shifted, and Office for Place became much more about design, but I think the genesis of it was quite political. The second thing I think is actually about its governance. So I think understandably the new government is looking at lots of these different types of organizations. Homes England, for example, chair, chief exec stepping down, like what's the future of that? And I know lots of other organizations are sort of thinking about where they're going to be positioned compared to central government, whether it's Historic England or such. So I think Office for Place hadn't quite maybe necessarily got to the place where the governance was clear, whether they was in government or whether they were out of government. And actually, interestingly, having spun public practice out of the GLA, it makes me reflect that we did that quite quickly before it was actually established to give us that independence, so that we were not so closely affiliated with Sadiq, who is still there in power, but there was a risk there. And in some ways, I suppose they could see their legacy as being design codes. And I think the question for me is actually, where is this new government going to position design? I think there's an opportunity to see that actually we want this knowledge to be embedded at a local authority level. And we have had a number of our associates working on design codes, whether it's in, I don't know, Derby or East Riding, and actually that kind of having that knowledge in-house, it's about the design codes, but it's actually goes to the point of being able to oversee it over a period of time. You can have the framework, you can have the policy, as Sasha's question was earlier, but for me, the fundamental thing about design is often actually a culture and an approach which comes with leadership and comes with the right skills in-house. So actually going back to Paul, you mentioning kind of John Prescott's passing, it's been, again, people have been sort of thinking about it within the architecture design, urban design sectors. His legacy was actually setting up the Urban Design Task Force, which was led by Lord Rogers. It was led by an architect in the 90s. And there they were tasked with thinking about what is the future of cities, what does sustainable cities look like. At that point, there was a lot of urban decline. And in a way, CABE grew and emerged out of that. So I do think I'd be keen to hear a bit more of a kind of where design and quality is with the new government. But I think that will come over time, and something like the new towns is a good example of where it'll be interesting to see how embedded that is in their approach.
Thank you. Really interesting answer. Thank you very much.
Agreed. And I think my sense is that design is most definitely here to stay. And it's very interesting for you to remind us of what the Labour government did in terms of design, because that was quite a different approach to the Margaret Thatcher, the developer knows best type of approach. Anyway, I must resist and ask Paul if he has a question that he would like to put to Pooja.
I do, Pooja, and it's going to be a spin-off of that exact last conversation. I wonder whether or not we are guilty in the planning world of trivializing what we were told in the document called By Design is a specialist area of expertise, in other words, design. Because do we tend to trivialize it by using terms such as we are looking for a beautiful scheme or a high-quality scheme or an inclusive scheme, and we therefore treat it as somehow a singular question, whereas it's actually a much, much more complicated test than that. By Design actually said it's an area of specialist expertise, even if lots of people have views about it. So if that's right, how would you describe the requisite test that we should be looking for in planning policy if we're ditching beauty?
It's a really tough one. And I think this is almost a fundamental challenge with design, is that it could be seen as a sort of grey area and therefore quite unpredictable. And I understand the kind of frustration that comes from the developer's perspective of saying we don't know what a planning officer is going to say in terms of design, because it is subjective. And obviously something like the National Model Design Codes and design codes in general, they're all trying to codify design, but sometimes I think you can codify it, but it comes back to my previous point about it being a kind of skills and expertise and an understanding, a culture of what does a good place look and feel like. And I think there's some very fundamental things, like you said, about what, the question is like, what makes a good place, right? And it's hard to say that. It's inclusive, it's adaptive. I think it's not necessarily replicable. There is something about local places and local characters, and building on that. There's something about it being built to last, and goes back to that point of thinking about the long term. But it should also bring happiness and bring joy, and people should feel happy and proud to be somewhere. So I don't know. I'm speaking to a room of lawyers. How did you codify what brings joy? You tell me that.
It's hard. But I think it can be done if you focus on areas of change and not, as it were, the whole borough. Because I think trying to do a design code for the whole borough is quite a frightening prospect, and can suck up far too much time and resource in a world where local government has very little. Now, we've got to stop, Pooja. Sorry. No, I need to remind you gently that you've got an important dinner at the RTPI to get to, and I need to hand back to Charlie.
Thanks, Mary. Thank you, Pooja. Have a very nice dinner. Thank you. Really insightful, fascinating, thought-provoking discussion. So thank you. Please do keep in touch with us all. We'd love to have you back. We are back on the 5th of December for our last regular show of the year with Lord Daniel Moylan, member of the House of Lords and chair of the Built Environment Committee. As I mentioned, it's the select committee that has responsibility for planning infrastructure. Before that, he was chair of the London Legacy Development Corporation, deputy chair of Transport for London, and a board member of Crossrail, as well as Boris Johnson's airports advisor. So a fascinating man, great fun too. Trust me, you'll love him. So he's on the 5th of December, and then that's it, except that we will probably do an NPPF special, as we always do, if and when it comes out, which may or may not be before Christmas. So, and then we will start in the new year with Ben Houchen, who is the mayor for Tees Valley, one of the metro mayors, who may well be getting more planning-related powers under the new planning infrastructure bill. So that's our lineup. Pooja, thank you so much again. Hope we meet in person before long. Everybody else, good evening. Maybe see some of you at Nipper dinner, maybe not. But see you all soon. Thank you again, Pooja. Bye-bye.